Some stories of the Kennedy family are told so often they become modern American myths. We know the tales of Camelot, of tragedy, of ambition, and of loss. We know the names by heart: Jack, Bobby, Jackie, and of course, Ted. But what about the stories that exist in the margins, in the quiet spaces between the headlines? What about the people who entered the saga mid-act, tasked with the impossible job of loving a man who was already a legend, a controversy, and a political institution all in one? This is the story of a woman who did just that. A woman who carried the Kennedy name for 17 years, longer than any other wife of the famous brothers, yet forever felt like she was standing just outside the spotlight. She was brilliant, accomplished, and a force in her own right. A successful lawyer from a proud and noble lineage that had nothing to do with Boston or Hyannisport. Yet when she married Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, she stepped into a world defined by ghosts. This is the story of Victoria Reggie Kennedy, the last Mrs. Kennedy, and her life spent in the shadow and the silence of a political empire. It's a tale not of weakness, but of a quiet, unyielding strength that may have been the dynasty's saving grace. To understand Victoria's journey, you have to understand the world she was about to enter. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Kennedy mystique was a complicated thing. The golden era of Camelot was a distant, painful memory. The assassinations of Jack and Bobby had left a permanent scar on the American psyche, and Ted, the youngest brother, was the sole survivor left to carry the immense weight of his family's political legacy. But his own story was far from a simple heroic narrative. He was the Lion of the Senate, a powerful and effective legislator who championed the poor and the disenfranchised. He was a booming, charismatic figure, a beloved uncle to a generation of Kennedys who had lost their fathers. But there was another side to Ted, a darker one that the public knew all too well. The incident at Chappaquiddick in 1969, where a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechny died after Ted drove his car off a bridge, was a permanent stain. It wasn't just a political scandal, it was a moral one that haunted him for the rest of his life. It shattered the image of Kennedy infallibility and painted him as reckless and privileged. In the years that followed, his personal life often seemed to confirm that perception. His first marriage to the elegant but fragile Joan Bennett Kennedy had dissolved under the pressure of his infidelities and the relentless public glare, ending in a painful and public divorce in 1982. The 80s were filled with stories of Ted's carousing, earning him a reputation as a hard-drinking womanizer. He was a paradox, a titan of policy and a man seemingly adrift in his personal life, burdened by grief, expectation, and his own worst impulses. This was the man Victoria Reggie would meet. It was a dynasty in its twilight years, powerful but wounded. The name Kennedy still opened every door, but it also came with a heavy price, perpetual scrutiny, impossible comparisons, and the ghosts of a more glorious past. The matriarch Rose was still alive, a symbol of stoic endurance. The women of the family, from Ethel to Jackie, had each carved out their own legendary status through tragedy and grace. Any woman entering this world wouldn't just be marrying a man. She would be auditioning for a role in American history, a role for which the standards had been set impossibly high. Long before she was a Kennedy, Victoria Ann Reggie was a star in her own universe. Born in 1954 in Crowley, Louisiana, she was the daughter of a distinguished family with deep roots in the Lebanese-American community. Her father, Edmund Reggie, was a powerful judge and banker, a kingmaker in Louisiana politics. Her mother, Doris, was a civic leader and a force of nature in her own right. The Reggies were a political family, but their world was one of Louisiana democratic circles, not the rarefied air of Hyannisport. They were devoutly Catholic, ambitious, and incredibly close-knit. Vicky, as she was known, inherited her parents' drive and intelligence. She was a brilliant student, graduating summa cum laude from Newcomb College at Tulane University, and then earning her law degree from Tulane Law School, again with high honors. She wasn't just book smart, she was sharp, articulate, and possessed a poise that belied her years. After law school, she moved to Washington, D.C., and built an impressive career as a banking and regulatory lawyer at a prestigious firm. She married a telecommunications attorney, Greer Racklin, and had 2 children, Curran and Caroline. By all accounts, her life was full and successful on its own terms. She was a respected professional, a mother, and a woman with her own identity. But her first marriage ended in divorce in 1990, leaving her a single mother navigating the demanding world of D.C. law. Her path first crossed with the Kennedys through her family's long-standing political connections. Her father, Judge Reggie, was a friend and ally of the Kennedys, having been a delegate who supported John F. Kennedy's presidential bid in 1960. The families knew each other for years, and Vicky had met the senator socially on a few occasions. But the real story began in 1991. Ted's mother, Rose, invited the Reggies for a dinner party. Ted, who was then in the midst of another personal scandal, the infamous Palm Beach incident involving his nephew, William Kennedy Smith, was at a low point. He was 59 years old, single, and his reputation was in tatters. Vicky was there that night. She was 37, a smart, stable, and composed woman who was entirely unimpressed by the Kennedy mystique. Perhaps that's what drew him to her. She wasn't a starstruck 20-something, she was a peer. She could talk policy with him, understand the pressures of public life, and, most importantly, she wasn't afraid of him or his baggage. Ted began to pursue her, but she was hesitant. As she later recalled, "I knew the good, the bad, and the ugly. I knew it all." She was a divorced mother of 2 young children, and the idea of stepping into the chaotic, high-stakes world of Ted Kennedy was daunting. Their courtship was not a whirlwind romance. It was a careful, considered process. Ted, for perhaps the first time in a long time, was the one who had to do the convincing. He called her constantly. He helped her son with a school project on the legislative process. He showed her a side of himself that the public rarely saw, thoughtful, attentive, and genuinely seeking a partner, not another conquest. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed moments of their courtship happened during a quiet dinner. Vicky, ever the lawyer, decided to address the elephant in the room head-on. She looked him in the eye and asked him directly about Chappaquiddick, about his drinking, about his reputation with women. She didn't want the sanitized public relations version. She wanted the truth from the man himself. It was a conversation that few would have dared to have. In that moment, she wasn't just a potential date. She was an equal, demanding accountability. Ted's willingness to engage with her on that level, to be vulnerable and honest about his deepest failings, was what ultimately changed her mind. She saw a man who was flawed, yes, but also one who was capable of introspection and change. He proposed to her on Easter Sunday of 1992. They were married a few months later in a private civil ceremony at his home in McLean, Virginia. It was a stark contrast to the grand society weddings of the Kennedy clan. The guest list was small, mostly family. Vicky wore a simple, elegant white suit. Her 2 children, Curran, then 9, and Caroline, then 6, were by her side. This wasn't a union designed for the cameras. It was a union designed for the 2 of them. But as she said, "I do," Vicky Reggie Racklin became Victoria Reggie Kennedy and stepped across a threshold into a life that would never be simple or private again. Becoming a Kennedy was less a marriage and more an immersion into a living history. From the moment the engagement was announced, the comparisons began. And the specter that loomed largest wasn't Joan, Ted's first wife, but Jackie. Jackie Kennedy Onassis was more than a former First Lady. She was a global icon of style, grace, and tragic dignity. She was the standard against which every woman associated with the family was measured. The press immediately began to draw parallels and more often contrasts. Vicky was a lawyer, not a debutante. She was professional and direct, not mysterious and ethereal. She was seen as practical, grounded, almost businesslike. The media narrative quickly cast her as the fixer. She was the sensible, stable woman brought in to tame the wild lion, to get his life in order so he could continue his important work in the Senate. While there was some truth to this, her influence on him was undeniably steadying. It was also a deeply reductive and, in some ways, insulting portrayal. It stripped her of her own agency and personality, reframing her as a mere accessory to his rehabilitation. One friend of hers commented to a reporter at the time, "She's nobody's fool and nobody's nanny." Inside the family, her reception was complex. The Kennedys are famously clannish, with their own inside jokes, shared memories of grief, and unspoken rules. Vicky, an outsider from Louisiana with no shared history of summers in Hyannisport, had to navigate this carefully. To her credit, she did it with immense grace. She focused on what mattered most: Ted and the children. She became a devoted stepmother to Ted's 3 children, Kara, Ted Jr., and Patrick, who had endured their parents' messy divorce and their father's public struggles. She created a stable, blended family, bridging the gap between her own 2 children and his. Their home in Washington became a warm, welcoming center, a stark change from the bachelor pad atmosphere that had preceded her. One of the most poignant, little-known stories of her early years as a Kennedy reveals the depth of her character. She made a conscious effort to build a relationship with Ted's first wife, Joan. It was a situation that could have been fraught with bitterness and rivalry. Joan had struggled for years with alcoholism and the pain of her life in the Kennedy spotlight. Instead of treating her as a rival, Vicky treated her with compassion and respect. She made sure Joan was always included in family events, especially those involving her children and grandchildren. She would call Joan to coordinate holidays and birthdays. It was a quiet act of profound decency, a refusal to play into the drama the public might have expected. She wasn't trying to replace Joan, she was trying to heal a fractured family. Her emotional impact on Ted was transformative. Friends and staffers who had known him for decades saw a man who was calmer, happier, and more focused than he had been in years. He stopped his notorious late-night carousing. He drank less. He seemed to find a peace that had long eluded him. A longtime aide once remarked that before Vicky, you could never be sure which Ted Kennedy would show up to a meeting: the brilliant legislator or the sullen, distracted man. After Vicky, it was always the brilliant legislator. She didn't do it by nagging or controlling him. She did it by providing a partnership of equals. She was his intellectual sparring partner, his most trusted advisor, and his fiercest defender. At dinner parties, they would debate policy. She would read drafts of his speeches, offering sharp, insightful critiques. She once said in a rare interview, "We talk about everything. He values my opinion not because I'm his wife, but because he respects my judgment." That quote captures the essence of their relationship. It wasn't based on the glamour of the Kennedy name, but on mutual respect. She loved him not for the legend he was, but for the man he was trying to be. And in her love, she gave him the safety to finally become that man. For all the good she did in private, Victoria's public role was fraught with complexity. The central controversy of her life as a Kennedy was one of authenticity. In the eyes of many Kennedy watchers and a significant portion of the public, She was never seen as a real Kennedy. This wasn't an official debate held on cable news, but a persistent underlying narrative that questioned her place in the pantheon. She was the second wife, the one who came along after the dynasty's golden age had passed. She hadn't been there for Camelot or for the tragedies of the 1960s. Her story was not interwoven with the family's foundational myths. This perception was fueled by subtle but constant othering. She was from Louisiana, not Massachusetts. Her heritage was Lebanese, not Irish. These distinctions were often highlighted in profiles written about her, creating an implicit contrast with the Kennedys' well-established Irish Catholic identity. While never overtly hostile, the narrative suggested she was an outlier, a Kennedy by marriage, in a family where bloodlines meant everything. The fact that she kept her own successful career for a time and was a professional woman with a life before Ted was sometimes twisted to imply her commitment was less total than that of the wives who came before. The debate over her influence was another point of contention. To her supporters, she was the secret weapon behind the most productive legislative period of Ted's career. In the 17 years they were married, he passed major bipartisan legislation, including the State Children's Health Insurance Program, SHIP, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Friends and colleagues credited Vicky's stabilizing presence and sharp political mind. She was his sounding board, helping him strategize and refine his arguments. She was often seen in the Senate gallery during important debates, a quiet but powerful symbol of support. Nick Littlefield, a longtime health policy advisor to Kennedy, stated unequivocally that the landmark mental health parity bill, a cause deeply personal to the family due to Joan's struggles, would never have passed without Vicky's strategic guidance and unwavering support. She helped Ted navigate the complex negotiations, keeping him focused and motivated. However, to detractors, her influence was seen as a sign of Ted's diminishment. Some old guard Kennedy loyalists whispered that she had insulated him, cutting him off from old friends and advisors. They saw a lion who had been tamed, his famous roguish charisma replaced by a more subdued, domestic version. This interpretation ignored the reality that the old Ted was also a man plagued by self-destructive tendencies that threatened to derail his entire legacy. Vicky didn't diminish him. She focused him, channeling his immense energy away from personal chaos and toward public service. Perhaps the most striking and rarely heard story that illuminates this tension comes from the fight over a judicial nomination. A candidate Ted was considering was known to have a complicated personal life. Some of his advisors urged him to look past it, arguing it was irrelevant to the job. It was Vicky who reportedly stepped in and posed a simple, devastating question. How can you, of all people, not consider this? She wasn't judging the candidate, but forcing her husband to confront his own history and the standards to which he, and those he endorsed, should be held. It was a moment of profound private accountability. She wasn't just protecting his political brand, she was guarding his moral compass. It was a role no one else could play, but it was one that happened entirely behind the scenes, leaving the public to debate her influence without ever knowing the true depth of it. She lived with the constant paradox of being simultaneously one of the most influential people in his life and one of the most underestimated figures in the Kennedy orbit. The long-term significance of Victoria Reggie Kennedy is not found in grand pronouncements or landmark speeches she herself delivered. Instead, her legacy is quieter, more profound, and woven into the very fabric of Ted Kennedy's final chapter and the evolution of the family itself. Her greatest impact was, without a doubt, the restoration of a man. By providing the stability and unconditional support he had lacked for decades, she enabled the final, most productive, and arguably most noble phase of his long career. Historians and former colleagues are nearly unanimous in their assessment. The Ted Kennedy of the 1990s and 2000s was a more effective, focused, and respected legislator than the man of the 70s and 80s. That change is an inseparable part of Victoria's story. She didn't just save a man, she helped salvage a legacy, ensuring that the Lion of the Senate would be remembered more for the laws he passed than for the scandals that had once defined him. Beyond her personal impact on her husband, Vicky subtly redefined the role of a Kennedy woman. She broke the mold. The women of the previous generation, from Rose to Jackie to Ethel, were primarily defined by their roles as mothers and steadfast widows, embodying a kind of tragic aristocratic stoicism. Joan, his first wife, represented a more fragile, vulnerable version of that role. Vicky, however, was different. She was a professional peer, an intellectual partner. She demonstrated that one could marry into the dynasty without being consumed by it. She maintained a distinct identity, and her strength was not in silent endurance, but in active, intelligent partnership. She created a new template, the Kennedy woman, as a strategic advisor and a power in her own right, even if that power was wielded quietly. This became most evident during Ted's final illness. When he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor in 2008, she became his everything. His primary caregiver, his medical advocate, his political stand-in, and the fierce guardian of his dignity. She marshaled the best doctors in the world, researched every possible treatment, and managed his care with the precision of a lawyer and the fierce love of a wife. In one of her most famous public moments, she delivered a moving, powerful speech at the 2008 Democratic National Convention. With Ted too ill to speak for long, she took the stage and spoke on his behalf, her voice ringing with passion and conviction, as she championed the cause of his life, universal health care. In that moment, she was no longer in his shadow. She was his voice. The world saw the strength and intelligence that Ted had relied on for years. After his death in 2009, she did not retreat from public life. She became the keeper of his flame, co-founding the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, an institution dedicated to educating the public about the role of the Senate and encouraging bipartisan cooperation. It was the perfect tribute to his life's work. Then, in a move that brought her own story full circle, she stepped fully into the spotlight on her own terms. In 2021, President Joe Biden, a close friend of both hers and Ted's, nominated her to be the U.S. ambassador to Austria. Her confirmation was overwhelmingly bipartisan, a testament to the respect she had earned on both sides of the aisle. The lawyer from Louisiana, who had married into America's most famous political family, had become a distinguished diplomat representing her country abroad. Her consequence is clear. She proved that the Kennedy story was not over, and that a legacy is not just something to be inherited, but something to be actively built, protected, and renewed. So, who was Victoria Reggie Kennedy? In the grand, often tragic opera of the Kennedy family, she was not a prima donna. She was not the subject of the breathless headlines or the heartbreaking tragedies that defined a generation. Her story is quieter, more subtle, but no less powerful. She arrived in the third act, a character introduced long after the main plot seemed set in stone, and she changed the ending. Her journey was a masterclass in dignity. She lived for nearly 2 decades under the impossible weight of comparison, in the shadow of giants like Jackie and the lingering pain of Chappaquiddick. She was constantly measured, analyzed, and often underestimated. Yet, she never engaged in the public drama. She never complained about the comparisons or fought for the spotlight. Instead, she put her head down and did the work of building a loving blended family, the work of healing a broken man, the work of supporting a historic legislative career, the work of preserving a legacy. Her story teaches us something vital about love and partnership. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, it was a union of two adults who saw each other clearly, flaws and all, and chose to build a life together. She didn't try to erase Ted's past, but helped him build a better future. She offered him not adoration, but accountability, not glamour, but grace. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.